I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
The President, salute the leader of our nation. The President, all pay allegiance to his station. With freedom's choice, the people's voice has chosen who shall represent our ideals and our liberty, the man who shall hold the office of the President.
In 1775, the son of a wealthy Virginia landowner, a gentleman farmer who had served 7 years as a colonel in the British Army, was appointed by the Continental Congress to be the commander-in-chief of the colonial army. George Washington was to lead 300,000 untrained, ill-equipped citizen soldiers against the armies of Great Britain.
From Bunker Hill to Yorktown, 6 long years, they fought, retreated, turned and fought again. Long Island, Princeton, Trenton, Saratoga, saw the fighting hearts of freedom-loving men. From Bunker Hill to Yorktown, 6 long years, one gallant phrase kept ringing in their ears.
I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
And they finished up at Yorktown with a mighty will what they started up on Bunker Hill.
The Revolutionary War had been fought, the victory won, and General Washington returned to his wife Martha at Mount Vernon to resume farming. But the new nation he had helped to create couldn't spare him. The country seethed with unrest. Congress was without leadership or power. Its paper money worth next to nothing, while tariffs brought trade between the states to a standstill. As Washington sadly wrote to a friend, there are combustibles in every state which a spark might set fire to. He attended the Constitutional Convention as a delegate from Virginia, but his reputation and prestige made him its natural presiding officer. After months of heated debate and prolonged argument, a new form of government began to emerge, and men of conflicting opinions looked to George Washington for leadership.
First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen.
Washington, who favored a strong central government controlled by wealthy, educated men, nevertheless scorned Alexander Hamilton's proposal that a monarchy be established with a titled nobility. He stood staunchly behind the new Constitution, and the states, which feared the strong central power embodied in the Constitution, placed their faith in the integrity of a man. In 1789, George Washington, by unanimous vote of the electors, was chosen to be the first president of the United States. Everything in his administration was a first in American history. He appointed the first cabinet, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. The first new states, Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee, were admitted to the Union. The Supreme Court met for the first time. The National Mint was established. The first census taken and the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were adopted. Washington served for 2 consecutive terms. An infant nation groped for identity, and as her parent, Washington faced all the hardships and outrages of political fortune. He was called tyrant and accused of injustices and imprudence. The beginning of a two-party political system made him the target of every ambitious politician. It was with a sense of relief that George Washington saw his 8 years in the presidency come to an end. Now, at last, he could retire to Mount Vernon. He had given his life to his country and guided her first faltering footsteps to the path of greatness. In December of 1799, he caught a cold that developed into a high fever. As was the custom of the day, the doctors bled him. And knowing the end was near, Washington spoke his last words. "I thank you for your attention. You had better not take any more trouble about me, but let me go quietly." The news went out, and everywhere people wept. Throughout the young country, the nation mourned the loss of its father.
First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, the father of our country, the father of our country, George Washington.
John Adams, the first vice president of the United States, now became the second president. Adams was a Federalist like Washington, and Thomas Jefferson, the man who had opposed him, became his vice president. Now, the character and patriotic record of John Adams was beyond reproach, but his administration was a stormy one. Convinced that the nation needed time for growth, he took it upon himself to stave off a war with France. And as so often happens, his efforts, though wise and courageous, were unpopular. The first president to occupy the White House, the man who has often been called our unhappiest president, John Adams lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the rights of all men. Born to be free, this is the thing we all possess. These are the rights of all men.
Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, statesman, author, musician, scientist, inventor, architect, and linguist. Now, this magnificent mind was to govern our country for the next 8 years. A fierce foe of tyranny and dedicated champion of the people, Jefferson very nearly was not elected. A 74-74 tie vote between he and Aaron Burr was thrown into the House of Representatives. Mobs thronged the streets of Washington, calling for Thomas Jefferson as the people's choice. And finally, on the 36th ballot, he was named president.
The people's choice, the people's choice, will back him to the end. Everybody's friend, the people's choice, the people's choice. You bet your life he'll win. We will get him in. The country needs a leader with a strong and fearless plan.
Someone who will guide her better.
Who will? He will. He's the man, the only man who can. So raise your voice, let's all rejoice and get behind the people's choice.
After 4 years of prosperity, Jefferson was virtually unopposed for a second term. His purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France doubled the territory of the United States and is the greatest peaceful annexation in history. Over 800,000 square miles for $15 million. The Federalist Party later became the Whigs and then the Republicans, while Jefferson's Democratic Republicans became the Democrats. And to this day, many Democrats claim Thomas Jefferson as the father of the party. On July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died. Two great men, two great presidents, two great symbols of American democracy.
War, 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 war. The British seas, American ships and sailors. It must cease. War. It must cease. War. If we must fight to stop them, war. War. Then we want no part of peace. War. War. War.
When James Madison took office in 1809, he knew that he was stepping into a hornet's nest. Having been Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, no one knew better than he that a war with England was brewing. He did all that he could to forestall it, but finally, under pressure from the war hawks in Congress and an outraged public, he went before Congress in 1812 and asked that war be declared, not knowing that only 24 hours earlier, the British government had voted to stop its abuses against American shipping. Now, if the war was unnecessary, it was nonetheless bitterly fought. In August of 1814, the British captured the city of Washington and put it to the torch. The nation struggled for sheer survival. Then in 1815, the tide of battle turned. America's new Navy scored resounding victories, and Andrew Jackson routed the British at New Orleans. James Madison finished his second term in a new era of peace and prosperity, so that when James Monroe became our fifth president in 1817, his administration became known as the era of good feeling. Soldier and statesman of long standing, James Monroe left in 8 years a record of accomplishment as great as any the White House has known. In his Monroe Doctrine, he set for all time the seal against foreign interference on American soil. It said bluntly to the world that all American countries belong to North and South Americans, and that the United States would tolerate no future colonizers or aggressors. But the era of good feeling was short-lived. When John Quincy Adams, the only man in our history ever actually raised to be president, reached that goal in 1824, he lacked the popularity of a Monroe. A public servant since age 14, this strongly independent man cared little for making friends. Now, if his father, John Adams, was our unhappiest president, he must surely have been one of our happiest ex-presidents, for he lived to see what no other man has seen. His son inaugurated as President of the United States.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the rights of all men.
The United States had grown out of its infancy into adolescence. A big, sprawling youth with a two-fisted spirit and a need for new frontiers. A rugged individualist whose prime example was to be our seventh president.
Andy Jackson ran the country, ran good. Andy Jackson, if Andy couldn't do it, no one could. Way back in 1767, as history will tell, came a bundle straight out of heaven and headed straight for well. Andy Jackson ran the country, ran good. Andy Jackson, if Andy couldn't do it, no one could. the same kind of lightning drove from our shores. With the White House in need of a resident, and he stacked his gun. Went and took on the job of the president up in Washington. Andy Jackson ran the country, ran it good. Andy Jackson, if Andy couldn't do it, no one could. People fall under them, their conditions he's got to find it strange. Then he said, step aside politicians, I ain't about to change. Andy Jackson ran the country, ran it good. Andy Jackson, if Andy couldn't do it, no one could.
Andrew Jackson retired to his plantation, the Hermitage, by all odds one of the most popular figures who ever held the office of president, and certainly no easy man to follow. Martin Van Buren, who succeeded him in 1837, found it rough going indeed. An experienced statesman, Van Buren had been handpicked by Jackson, but he served only one troubled term. The first president not born a British subject, he was replaced by the man who took the longest stride in American history, from the clerk of the county court to the President of the United States. William Henry Harrison, hero of the Indian War at Tippecanoe, general, senator, and minister to Columbia, had been barred from federal office during the Jacksonian era. He was inaugurated on March 4, 1841, and only 1 month later died in the White House. John Tyler became the first vice president ever to fill an unexpired term of a president. Son of an influential Virginia lawyer, Tyler was nominated as Harrison's vice president to attract the vote of the slave-holding South and to balance the ticket.
Tippecanoe and Tyler too, both for the price of one. The man who whipped Tecumseh and Virginia's favorite son. Tippecanoe and Tyler too, after the voting's done, just go to the White House and you will see, running the nation for you and me. Tippecanoe, Tippecanoe, Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Tyler was most unpopular within his own Whig party, and that all but stifled legislation during his term. It was only on his last day in office that he was finally able to sign the bill annexing Texas as part of the United States, thereby igniting the spark of war which his successor James Knox Polk would fan into flame. In 1844, out of a deadlocked Democratic convention, James Knox Polk became our first dark horse president, and having promised a firm stand against Mexico, President Polk now fulfilled that pledge in shot and shell.
Remember the Alamo, remember Santa Anna and those heroic men who stood and fought against him and will never fight again. Remember the Alamo, refusing to surrender, they battled and were slain, and you and I must fight to prove they didn't die in vain. Remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo.
The battle for Texas was fought and won, but Polk, never a popular president, remained under attack. The issue of slavery was becoming increasingly hotter, and no Northerner was unhappy to see James Knox Polk leave the White House in 1849. General Zachary Taylor, the heralded hero of the Mexican-American War, became our 12th president. Taylor, more soldier than statesman, served only 16 months before death intervened. But during his short tenure of office, he had taken a strong stand in defense of the Union. Although a slave owner himself, he denounced secession as treasonable, a position directly opposed to that of his vice president, who now became president. Millard Fillmore reversed those policies and served out his term in a storm of protest, fading in his bid for re-election in 1852. And on March 4th, 1853, Franklin Pierce, our second dark horse president, was inaugurated. Pierce, like Fillmore, upheld the rights of slavery, and after one beleaguered term was cast aside by his party in favor of Senator James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. Long before Buchanan, our only bachelor president, took office, the fuse of civil war had been lighted. Now the Supreme Court upheld the Dred Scott decision that Congress had no power to keep slavery out of the territories. John Brown, the demented abolitionist, staged his raid at Harper's Ferry, and blamed for a web of circumstances beyond his control, James Buchanan left the White House with Abraham Lincoln's cry that the nation could not endure half slave and half free ringing through the land. The United States had had 8 consecutive presidents who had served only one term or less. And now, in her hour of greatest need, the nation searched among her sons for a strong leader, for a true man of the people.
The country needs a leader with a strong and fearless plan.
Someone who will guide her better.
Who will? He will. He's the man, the only man who can. So raise your voice, let's all rejoice, and get behind the people's choice.
People knew when they saw his smile, here's a man you can trust. Easy going and friendly style, honest day, tall and lean as a poplar tree, manners simple as dust, eyes that whispered of sympathy, honest day.
A true man of the people. If ever a man fitted these words, it was Abraham Lincoln. Born and raised in the humblest of circumstances, self-educated, as physically unattractive as his soul was handsome. Here was the rare man who could fight for a cause with all of his might, heart, and mind, and yet harbor no malice for those who opposed him. Almost a political unknown, in 1858, Lincoln ran against Stephen Douglas as a candidate for the Senate. He was defeated, but through the now famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, his name and his ideals became known throughout the country. And in 1860, the new Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln for president. Lincoln had made his position clear from the start. He had said the struggle over slavery was as old as man's struggle between right and wrong, or between freedom and tyranny. That it was essentially a struggle against all who would say, you work and toil and earn bread, and I'll eat it. The honor of the South had been insulted beyond tolerance, and its way of life threatened beyond endurance. Within weeks after his election, 7 states seceded from the Union. Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, and on April 12th, the bombardment of Fort Sumter began the Civil War.
Brother against brother, Mother Nation despair. Brother against brother, sorrow we share.
For 4 terrible years, the nation was drenched in its own blood. And through those years, no American suffered more than did Abraham Lincoln. This man who abhorred violence was its employer. Tortured and alone, he bore the brunt of the bitter conflict. He was ridiculed, statesmen deserted him, there was even talk of forcing him to resign. And through it all, his one thought was for the preservation of the Union. With the fall of Richmond, victory was assured. And since it's easy to champion a winner, Lincoln's popularity was reestablished. To his own surprise, he was overwhelmingly elected to a 2nd term. Now his work was just begun. With the Union saved, peace and forgiveness became his abiding passion. With malice toward none, with charity for all. But the nation was never to see the nobility of those sentiments become a reality. For on the night of April 14, 1865, a crazed assassin, John Wilkes Booth, crept up the stairs in Ford's Theater to the box where the president sat and fired a shot into the back of his head. Abraham Lincoln, emancipator of the slaves, savior of the Union, died the next day. But within the imperishable spirit of truth and freedom, he lived, still lives, and shall always live.
Heart as big as the summer sky, humble, faithful, and just. Here's a man who can never die. Honest Abe, honest
Andrew Johnson tried valiantly to carry out Lincoln's policies, but both the Congress and Senate were against him. And in 1868, he was replaced by the man the American people really wanted for their president.
U.S. Grant, U.S. Grant, never heard the words the U.S. can't. He'll get things done just like he won the war for the U.S. U.S. Grant. Rutherford behaves, Rutherford behaves. We like his looks and we like his ways. Garfield, James Garfield, he's the man we need, he's the man to lead.
Assassinated, shot in the back, a crime, a disgrace.
And Chester Allen Arthur must take his place. Grover Cleveland, Grover the good, he'll do the job the way he should. Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, the greatest of men. We want Cleveland, Grover Cleveland, Grover Cleveland again.
Yes, in 1892, Grover Cleveland became the only man ever to regain the presidency after having lost it. Since the death of Lincoln, the United States had known political upheaval, depressions, labor strikes, every manner of growing pain a nation can suffer, and had come out of it bigger, stronger, and prouder than ever. And she wasn't through growing yet. Under the administration of William McKinley, the United States sided with the Cuban Revolution against the tyranny of Spain. Cuba was freed, and Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines became United States possessions. That same year, Hawaii was annexed. And out of the Spanish-American War rode the gall-darndest hero in American history, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt.
Charge up San Juan Hill, toughest fighting force in the land. The Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt in command.
Theodore Roosevelt came out of the war a living legend. He was elected to the vice presidency, and when William McKinley became our third president to fall victim to an assassin's bullet, he became the president. Elected for another term, he led the country with the same fighting energy with which he led the Rough Riders. Or as a member of the White House staff said, we woke up every morning wondering what new adventure we were off on when Roosevelt was president. Not since Andy Jackson had any man so captured the imagination of the people, and not since Lincoln had any man so captured their hearts. Teddy Roosevelt, the beloved Rough Rider, left a bold mark on American history and on the history of the world.
The Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt in command.
In 1909, William Howard Taft took on the toughest job around, that of following a popular and colorful president. A big jovial man and a naval executive, Taft once called the White House the loneliest place in the world and was more than happy to vacate it in favor of Woodrow Wilson in 1913.
Not goodbye, girls, only au revoir. We've got to go to France to finish up a little war. We'll be back to love you like before. It's not goodbye, girls, it's only au revoir.
In his first 4 years as president, the scholarly Woodrow Wilson enacted more economic reforms than had ever been made in that length of time. But war raged in Europe, and he was elected to a second term, not on his record for reforms, but as a man who had kept us out of war. But in April of 1917, he was forced to give up the struggle for neutrality and ask Congress to declare war on Germany. The greatest conflict man had ever known tore the world asunder, and Woodrow Wilson stood like a beacon of hope in a sea of insanity. His one great dream was for the establishment of an international organization to deal with world problems and avert future wars. His League of Nations was established, but the United States, still relying on two oceans for protection, prevented our membership in the League by refusing to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson left the White House, his health broken, but his spirit and dignity intact, convinced that time would prove him right.
Back to normal, no more war. We want to live like we lived before. Warren G. Harding is equal to the shore. Getting back to normal, no more war. No more war.
But normalcy never means the same today as it did yesterday. And Warren G. Harding served a difficult 4 years. He was betrayed by friends. And the Teapot Dome scandal, when high government officials leased property belonging to the Navy to private interests, rocked the nation. After an exhausting tour in defense of his administration, Warren G. Harding died in office. Calvin Coolidge became our 30th president and served through 5.5 years of unprecedented prosperity. He could easily have had the nomination for another term, but he issued the single brief statement, "I do not choose to run," and the presidency passed to Herbert Clark Hoover. The man who had worked so selflessly to feed the starving people of Europe that the word Hooverize, meaning to sacrifice willingly so that others might eat, had become a part of our language. Now, with the breakdown of a wartime economy, many of his own countrymen faced starvation. A Great Depression engulfed the nation, and once again she searched among her sons for a strong leader to guide her through the storm.
Nothing to fear but fear itself, as long as our faith doesn't fail. We can face any storm with head held high and a smile as a shield from the gale. If we truly believe in what we feel, the moment our doubts disappear, we can see shining clear like the sun through a tear. We have nothing to fear but fear.
In his first inaugural address in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt told a frightened nation, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Our primary task is to put people to work." And to that end, more legislation was passed within the next 99 days than in any previous Congress. Saint or demon, radical or humanitarian, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not the type of man to arouse any half-hearted feelings. People either revered or hated him. But his New Deal had obviously made more friends than enemies. For in 1936, he was re-elected with a plurality of 10 million votes. Now, less than 2 decades after the world had been made safe for democracy, the nightmare of another world conflict loomed in Europe. And Franklin Roosevelt worked tirelessly to build up solidarity among the countries of the Western Hemisphere. Breaking with tradition in 1940, he ran and was elected for a 3rd term. And on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor plunged us into war. Not only the United States, but the whole free world was locked in a violent death struggle. And elected for a 4th term, FDR was determined that this time we should not win the war and lose the peace. He traveled far and wide to bring the free nations of the world into an alliance. The United Nations was born, but he did not live to attend its first session. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. And with the war not yet won, Harry S. Truman became our 33rd president. Pledging himself to maintain Roosevelt's policies, he saw us through the war, and with a spunk and fiery spirit that no one had guessed he possessed, Truman faced the problems of a post-war atomic world. and in 1948, against all predictions, was elected to a second term.
Go get 'em, Harry, you'll show 'em all. You might best with your back against the wall. Go get 'em, Harry,
Fight for the rise, and we'll back you, Harry, with all the nation's might.
And soon all the nation's might backed up the president's decision to fight against aggression in Korea. Harry S. Truman had taken on a gigantic responsibility, but Franklin D. Roosevelt had bequeathed to him and to all of us an unconquerable weapon, the reaffirmation of faith in our four freedoms: freedom of speech and of worship, from want and from fear.
If we truly believe in what we feel, the moment our doubts disappear, we can see shining clear like the sun through a tear. We have nothing to fear but fear.
Dwight D. Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a name that echoes through history, a living symbol of Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The man who led the free world to victory in Europe, Dwight David Eisenhower, became our 34th president in 1952. His first administration saw the end of the war in Korea, but the intensifying of the so-called Cold War between communism and democracy throughout the world. Stricken by a heart attack in 1955, the undefeatable Ike fought his way back to health and re-election in '56. Never in the history of the world has one nation been so looked to for guidance, protection, and righteous example. And seldom has the name of one man so echoed throughout the world as a symbol of hope, courage, and freedom.
Dwight D. Eisenhower, 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 Eisenhower.
Yes, the United States has seen presidents from all stations in life. Some have been more popular than others, some more effective than others. But three things they share in common, and shall continue to share in common with all our future presidents. The President of the United States has always been a great man, a free man, and chosen by a free people.
With freedom's choice now